Hello everyone. In this video I will talk about the evolution of identity management. This is a huge topic, so this will be a simplified version of the concept. And it will also focus a little on the upcoming changes in the eIDAS regulation, namely the introduction of digital wallets. And what are they and how did we end up with this concept? So the most common, I would say, and the initial way of handling identity management is that a user using, for example, a computer over the internet is accessing or logging into some kind of service. This service has, in many cases, some kind of database storing identity information about this user. It could be a username and a password, which is probably one of the most common ways to store the identity management or information about the user. So the user simply goes to a website, logs into the service, and the service knows that this is the correct user because the user supplies the username and their stored password. So the next way identity management sort of evolved was that you separated where the actual username and user password is stored. So it's not longer stored at the actual service. So what happens is that this information is instead stored at an identity provider. So when a user wants to use a service, let's say over the internet using their computer, the user go to a website where the service is, but instead of actually inputting the username and the password at the website, they are actually redirected to an identity provider. And at that identity provider, they supply their username and password. Then the identity provider can communicate back to the service saying that this is a verified user and they should be able to log into your system. So this has a lot of benefits doing this sort of separation. It means that the user could potentially only have one username and password and use that same identification information to several services. So basically the services could be grouped together, or rather the user can use the same information to access several services. For example, this can be used today using your Google or Facebook account. So you use the same account to log into different services that are not actually really Facebook or Google. But Facebook or Google in this case act as your identity provider. This is also commonly referred to as single sign-on. And how this changed even further, and another benefit of doing this separation is that you can also group the identity providers together. And this is commonly called a federation. So basically you federate several identity providers. One example within the SUNET community is the federation SWAMID that we have. And SWAMID contains all the identity providers, or rather all the users in all the identity providers that are hosted by all the different organizations part of the federations, like universities and colleges and all the different research organizations part of the SUNET community. So a big benefit of having this, another big benefit of having this separation is that you can add sort of rules based on the federation and not only just each separate identity provider and all the services connected to this federation. So for example, when you have a new service, you can connect that service to the federation, and with only one integration, you simply allow access for potentially all the users in this federation to log in with already existing accounts into this new service, rather than having to do a lot of different integrations to different identity providers. There are also some drawbacks or challenges with this solution. And one is that when you take this on as large scale as Europe, when you're talking about countries that are involved in this, there is a concern in regards that in this case the identity provider will know when a user is logging in at a certain service. This might not be something a user would like that the identity provider have the possibility to track them. So this is one of the sort of feedbacks in the review of the eIDAS regulation that has led to the suggested updates, which involve the concept of the digital wallets. So how does this work when you're using a wallet? So one example could be that a user is using their smartphone to store the wallet, and it's in the wallet now that the actual sort of credential for the user, the credential about their identity, is stored. But how do the user get this credential? It's in most cases it's from a credential issuer, because services might not in certain instances trust the user or individual themselves because they don't necessarily already have a trust relationship. So the user can download a credential from a credential issuer, which if it's an identity could act or be seen as the identity provider for the user. But at the same time, the credential issuer also uploads some kind of cryptographic information about this credential in a public verifiable data registry. So what happens in next step is that if the user then wants to log into a service, let's say on the internet, they can supply their credential or their identity credential to the service. But again, how does the service know that the user actually is who they say they are? This is when the verifiable data registry come into use. So the service or the verifier can check the credential that the user is supplying and verify that there is, for example, an organization that this verifier has as earlier trust relationship with that actually can verify the credential that they are given by the user. This is done without any communication between the credential issuer and the verifier. So the potential tracking possibilities are not really there anymore, like in the earlier model with the federated identity management. So looking at this from an evolutionary perspective, sort of who has control over the verifiable credential? In the first scenario, which is still a very common scenario, the user and the service provider talk directly to each other, and it's the service provider that is in control over the verifiable credential, which in most cases is just a username and password. In the second model, it's the identity provider that is in control over the verifiable credential, which in many cases, again, is just a username and a password. And in the third model that we are starting to see pop up and that we are working with now, is that it's actually the user that is in control over the verifiable credential. So the user decides when and where this should be used, and it's not known by anyone else other than actually the services or the verifier that the user is in connection with. But it's more up to the user, and it's less possibilities to track the user when they are, for example, logging into a service. So that's a brief overview of the evolution of identity management, and stay tuned for more videos about digital wallets and the changes coming up in the eIDAS regulation. Take care. Bye.